Hello and welcome to part 3 of this 4 part of the practical guide for evaluation. And this part here, we're talking about 10 common mistakes that people make when conducting an evaluation. And this 10 common mistakes are something that I've seen over the last 10 years that I've worked with the schools here in Singapore. And these are very common mistakes. And the additional thing that I'd like to share with you is what you can do about it and how you can avoid them. So, what are the 10 common mistakes? These are the 10 common mistakes that we see very often. And if you look at this 10, essentially we are able to break it down into, categorize them into three broad areas. And I'd like to share with you this what these three broad areas are instead of going into each and every single mistakes there, which might be a bit too lengthy. So the three broad areas in terms of the common mistakes and what you can do about it. Now, the top one that I see is essentially focus on this area on data and information, or sometimes the lack thereof. Yeah. Key thing is that you need to have a set of valid and reliable data in order to help you do the monitoring as well as to help you perform a performance analysis. As what we say in the part 2 of the guide, you need to have a regular monitoring and you need to evaluate your performance at the end of the day. Now, how would you be able to do that if you do not have a valid and reliable set of data and information? So very often, sometimes what people do is they only use hard data. So, like for example, they look at participation rate, and they will look at attendance, and they'll look at number of people who have signed up for this course, or number of people who are able to carry out this duty. Yeah. While hard data, it's good. Sometimes it's also critical to use supplementary data. And when we say supplementary data, what do we look at? For example, some example that I can give you are, for instance, survey results. Yeah, feedback. Those could be sometimes anecdotal, but essentially you want to be able to supplement some of this data in addition to the hard data that you're using to kind of give you a full and complete picture. Okay, so using relying only on the hard data sometimes can be easy depending on the type of organization you are. For example, I give you an example in the manufacturing context. Having hard data could be very easy. Whereas when it comes to a more service kind of an organization, sometimes deriving hard data may not be all that reliable. And so that's why from time to time you want to be able to select and use supplementary data along with the hard data that you use. Now, the other common mistake that I see sometimes is that because in a context like education, for example, sometimes it's very hard to identify some hard data. And so that's where people kind of lean to the other end of the spectrum, whereby they use only supplementary evidences alone. So relying on surveys and anecdotal feedback in itself will not be sufficient. So if, for example, if you're looking at monitoring the implementation, it is not sufficient to go around asking people, have you implemented? You in addition to asking people, have you implemented, how they felt about the implementation of the program or process, you might also want to have some hard data, like how many times do you do it, how many times do you do it a week, for example, and when you do it, what's the intensity of it, for example. Yeah. Likewise, when you're doing a performance analysis, you want to decide whether the target is met. Relying purely on a survey might not be sufficient. Okay, so here is where one of the biggest common mistakes that I see people make: not having a set of valid and reliable data and information, and as a result of that, the analysis and the monitoring becomes a little bit nebulous. Yeah, so that's the first block. Now the second block is structured approach, and what we mean by that is that sometimes there is a lack of consistency. So remember in the part two of the practical guide, we say that one of the key thing to look out for, or one of the key thing to look out for when you're doing an evaluation, is that there must be consistency. So what do we mean by consistency? Consistency could be in terms of the timing that you do it. So for example, if at the end of every year it's where you perform a series of evaluation, at the end of every year going forward, you would have to be conducting the same evaluation. So not like in some year you do it, some year you don't, or some years you do like 3 times, some years you only do it 1 time. So that's a lack of consistency. The other way of looking at lack of consistency is that the manner in which you carry out the evaluation needs to be consistent. So if you have a particular process, yeah, or a specified approach to conducting evaluation, that needs to be consistent throughout. So not like in some years you will look at data a little bit more because you have those data, but in other years you will not look at data at all because you forget to collect the data, for example. So that's that lack of consistency. So consistency is key here, and one of the best way is to develop a structured approach. Now, what do we mean by a structured approach? As you can see in terms of evaluation, there are various models that you can use when you're conducting an evaluation. So something as simple as a PDCA cycle could be used for evaluation. Something a little bit more robust, like what EFQM proposes, the radar logic, is also another approach. So regardless, any of these approaches will do, but regardless, it's important for you to have a structured approach and something that is implemented on a consistent basis and consistently throughout the organization itself. Now, one thing to note here is that when we talk about a structured approach, do not get overboard and become too structured. In other words, you have a one size fits all for every form of evaluation. I recall some time back, I see in some of the schools whereby for every evaluation they follow the same process. Now, this may not be all realistic because when you are looking at evaluation, there are 3 levels of evaluation: evaluation at program level, evaluation at process level, and evaluation at plan approach level. So obviously, in terms of consistency, you want to have a broad approach that kind of guide, or a set of guiding principles to help you determine how you would do when you conduct an evaluation. That said, you may not necessarily use the same instrument for all 3 levels. So for example, if you're conducting a program review, something like a simple after action review process would be good enough. However, when you're looking at a process evaluation, an after action review of a process evaluation would not be sufficient. So in those instances, you might want to be able to use appropriate instruments and or appropriate processes to conduct an evaluation. So the key here is that you need to have a structured approach, but you want to set up some general guidelines for people to follow. That said, you do not want to restrict people to just one specific process, because otherwise it becomes too rigid, or it becomes too demanding for a low level evaluation and too simple for a higher level evaluation. So structured approach, that's a second common mistake. And the last one is sometimes people do all this evaluation, they go through this entire process itself with diligence and effort and good intention, but at the end of the day, it doesn't feed forward to future plans. Now, that's something that sometimes either get overlooked, or people just doesn't have that look back mentality to kind of say that, okay, let's look at what happened when we conduct evaluation, what some of the strengths, what some of the weaknesses, and how can we incorporate that into our future plans. So for some organizations, this comes across as very obvious, but in some organizations, not so. So I encourage you to take a look at to see whether have you been making a point to make sure that whatever evaluation, whatever comes out of the evaluation, the learnings, Does it get translated into future plans? Now let's look at the third category of mistakes, which I term it as best practices and improvements. And in this part here, some of the common mistakes I see is lack of in-depth analysis. Now, because of the lack of in-depth analysis, it is sometimes not possible to identify best practices or identify improvement opportunities. Now, when we say in-depth analysis, your question that you might have would be, how in-depth is in-depth? Yeah. So one way to think about it is that, for instance, when you conduct a performance analysis, it's just asking whether have you achieved your targets. Is that sufficient? Now the answer, as you know, is probably no. So if just looking at whether have you achieved the targets itself, it's sufficient or not, then what else must you do? So for example, in addition to look at whether you have achieved your targets, you might want to ask yourself, or you might want to determine whether is there a positive trend. Has it been trending upwards, or have you reached a plateau whereby you have a stabilized trend? In addition to that, you might want to ask yourself, how are you doing vis-a-vis your competitors? So you may be performing so well and you may be exceeding your targets and having a positive trend. Why? Because maybe you have always been setting very much lower targets. Yeah, and so bringing in comparison data, it's good because it puts things into perspective, and it also gives you an indication of where you stand. So that's what we meant when we say in-depth analysis. Now, of course, without the in-depth analysis, identifying improvements would be difficult. And sometimes even when you identify improvements, some mistakes I see is that some of these improvements are what we call substandard. What do we mean by that? Because sometimes these improvements are purely coming from a particular source, which could be a particular person, or they are just going round and round and looking at small level iteration, which may not lead to a breakthrough. So one of the best way to kind of work around this substandard improvement is to ask yourself, in addition to internal, where else can I look out for when I look at improvements? Can I look at external sources of improvement? So for example, can I look at what other organizations or other industries are doing? And with that, I kind of bring in some good practices, for example. Or could I look at literature review? So without just relying on one source or just an internal source to look at improvements, sometimes that may lead to a substandard improvements. And the last one is what I call a lack of proper documentation. Evaluation is done, but so if you stack it up, sometimes it's not done in a very structured manner. Recall in part one of this practical guide, we say Edward Deming said that if you can't describe everything you do in the form of a process, you really do not know what you're doing. The other aspect that Deming, or it's implicit in Deming's saying, is that you must have a way to document those process, because without proper documentation, sometimes it's just being discussed, and all the facts and all these learnings will be lost. So there must be a methodological way or a systematic way to kind of capture this evaluation process. Now, if you were to ask me what is the best way to look at or to have a proper documentation, having some sort of a template whereby you follow your process would be most ideal. So for example, if you use a very simple PDCA cycle as your evaluation process, then of course your documentation has to be designed in such a way that it follows the PDCA cycle. So what you do under plan, what you do under do, under check, and under act. Yeah, so that's one way to ensure that there is proper documentation. The other thing that it's quite obvious, but sometimes it's left untapped, is that when you document something, you are essentially codifying institutional knowledge. And when you're able to codify that knowledge, essentially, especially in our context now, everyone is a knowledge worker. You are able to capture that knowledge and preserve it or retain it in the organization, because otherwise, if the knowledge is in the person's head And once the person walked out of the organization, the knowledge walks out with that person itself. All right, so in summary, these are our three broad categories of mistakes and how to avoid them. So the data and information, you need to have a set of valid and reliable data, not just relying on hard data, but as well as supplementary data. Avoid supplementary data alone if you can help it. I know sometimes it may be a little difficult. A structured approach, you need to be consistent. Well-defined process will be good. So there are many well-defined processes out there. For example, like the logic model could be one. The 4 levels of conversation could be one. The ladder of inference could be one. So there are many different type of a approach to evaluation. And of course, when we talk about a structured approach, that it must feed forward to future plans. So no point doing all this evaluation at the end of the day you file it. It looks really nice, but it doesn't get fed forward into the future plan. So mistakes keep happening. Last one is, of course, the best practices and improvements. So how do you conduct an in-depth analysis? As we said earlier, not just looking at targets, but also trends as well as comparison. And looking out for sources of improvements. Where do you look for sources of improvements? And lastly, to have proper documentation. Now, as always, if you find this recording or this video independently outside of our website, please head on down to our website at lineconsulting.com. That is lineconsulting, one word.com. And sign up at no charge to get all this 4 part of this practical guide plus upcoming webinars that we'll conduct from time to time. And in addition to that, you will be able to use the recording software to ask me a question, and we'll incorporate that in future episodes or future practical guides to kind of address those questions that you have. Right. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you in part 4 of this practical guide.